Hi guys, we'll get started in about a minute, but we are going to use 3 resources today. And if you go to tinyurl.com/APLink virtual lessons, you'll see a bunch of files there. You can just open anything that says 4.8 at the beginning of it. Again, there should be 3 things. One that says 4.8 AP Practice Thatcher. One says 4.8 Prompt for Lesson Albright. And the other is 4.8 Rhetorical Analysis Things to Remember. So if you want to go ahead and access that URL, open the links, get ready for today, and then we'll start in about a minute. All right, let's go ahead and start. It's good to see you guys again. Again, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a URL to access our files. It's also in the show more part of the video description in case you want the actual link. And then if you'll go into the folder, you'll see a variety of resources since we started this. Today, we're going to be working with 3 separate things. Throughout the lesson, we're going to talk about a prompt that's from Albright. Then for your AP practice, you'll have something called 4.8 AP Practice Thatcher. And then I've also given you a document that you can make a copy of or you could download that you can start taking some notes on, and I'll explain that later. And that's called 4.8 Rhetorical Analysis Things to Remember. So again, here's the link, the URL's on the screen, or you can access the direct URL through the show more, so many words, the show more part of the description of the video. All right, I'm Mrs. Velitis. It's good to see you guys again. I was on spring break last week and took time just to kind of unplug, do nothing. I read 2 books. I watched a lot of terrible TV. It was exactly what I needed to kind of recharge my batteries, but it is nice to see you guys again. I'm missing my own students, so it's nice to feel like I can do something for students. So it's good to see you again. Before we really dive into today's lesson, I want us to review what you guys learned yesterday. Yesterday, you were wrapping up the argument prompt, and you were given this particular prompt to write an introduction to. And the prompt says, one of the first-year student orientation initiatives at a local university is to collect incoming students' cell phones and keep them for 48 hours. The purpose of the initiative is to give students an opportunity to integrate into their new school culture and make friends on campus. Carefully consider the effects of this initiative and the extent to which they might support, complicate, or contradict its intended goals. Use appropriate specific evidence to illustrate and develop your position on the advisability of the 48-hour cell phone ban. And the students who watched yesterday were asked to write an introduction for this particular prompt. Specifically, Mrs. Knight said, in your introduction, make sure you have an attention getter, some background, some context, and a thesis statement in the hopes that if you incorporate those 4 things, you'd be able to illustrate the complexity of the situation, set up the focus of your argument a little bit. So since I can't read your own introductions and give you feedback on them, I thought that it'd be better for us to look at a sample and mark it up a little bit and then ask you to kind of compare and contrast how your introduction compares to this one. Obviously, the ideas are not going to be the same. The construction isn't going to be the same. You might not follow the exact same order. But here you'll see, and you can read in a moment, but here you'll see just physically that there are the 4 separate colors and that there's a lot of context provided for this particular introduction. What I'm going to ask for you to do is to hit pause on your recording and take roughly 3 minutes to read through this introduction and thinking about, why is this highlighted in yellow? Why is this highlighted in green? Where do I see the thesis? Why is it in 2 sentences? So reading through the introduction with those color codes in mind. And then I'm also going to ask for you to annotate your own introduction. You might not highlight it if you don't have a highlighter nearby. So it could just be marking in the margins which of those 4 things you have: the attention getter, the background, the context, or the thesis. So take about 3 minutes to pause the recording, read this sample with those annotations in mind, and then annotate your own. And then I'll come back in and give you, when you're ready, you can hit play again, and I'll give you some things to think about. All right, so if you've just finished annotating your own sample, you might look at things like, do you have all 4 of those elements? You might compare and contrast. So you might look at the hook here and then look at your own attention getter and look at the extent to which they are really capturing the attention. Is it sophisticated or is it a cliche, as Mrs. Knight referenced yesterday? You might look at your thesis and compare it to this sample thesis. Again, I'm assuming that the language won't be the same. The ideas, the position might not be the same, but are you taking a position or a stance like you see here in this thesis? So you might want to pause again if you need to just think about the extent to which your sample, your introduction matches the sample. What did you do well? What did you do better than the sample, possibly? And then how could you improve your own writing now that you've seen a sample? So you might pause again if you need it. Otherwise, we'll move on. I don't know if you were like me or my students, but last Friday, a bomb was dropped on the AP language world, and I wanted to take just a few minutes to address with you what our exam will look like this year. I know that you received an email from College Board, and it's basically, I'm going to give you the exact same information. I don't have extra intel or any, secret information, but I do want to make sure that you guys are aware of what the prompt will be and what you'll be asked to do. So your AP exam, based on feedback from students and from teachers, has been pushed back about a week to May 20th, and it will take place at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on some sort of a to-be-announced secure server or application or platform or something. Students will be asked to log in about half an hour beforehand. So that should be, if you're on the Eastern Standard Time, you logging in around 1:30, and then at 2 o'clock, you'll be given the prompt itself. During that time, you have 45 minutes to read the passage and write the essay, and then 5 minutes to upload it to a secure server. It is going to be a rhetorical analysis essay. That's the free response question they have selected. And you have the option to either handwrite it or to type it. And I've had several of my students reach out and say, what would you recommend? And it's tough for me to, even with my own students who I know very well, it's tough for me to say what you should or shouldn't do. I do think it's important to consider how you are as a test taker and how you approach tasks. Handwriting might be nice, so then on a device, you could pull up the passage itself. So you can have the passage on a screen and then handwrite, so you can just look back and forth. If it is, my understanding is if you are typing, you'll probably need to scroll back and forth. So scroll up to see the passage, scroll down to type. Again, we've not been given a lot of information about the platform, so I could be wrong about that. But for some of you, you might prefer to type because you can type faster and you're okay with having to scroll back and forth. For others, you might say, I need to minimize as many distractions as possible. So I'm going to have the prompt pulled up and then I'm going to handwrite it. Either one is permissible. You can even do it on your cell phones if you would like. I think it really is a personal choice. So I think it's good to hear the pros and the cons and then evaluate what type of learner or test taker are you. And then the last thing is you are allowed to have a notes page. I have a little asterisk next to that. So I've given you in the resources for today a sample notes page that you might print out or make a copy of and take notes directly on. This, though, I would really encourage you to use more to review prior to the exam. or to have it off to the side when you're taking the actual exam. Primarily because if you are spending time going back through your notes while you're writing, it's probably going to cut down on the efficacy of your writing and your reading. It'll get blocked, it'll get a little stunted. It'll take you a few seconds to get back into the ideas themselves. So you could think about it that way. I would also encourage you to keep your notes very brief, very generic. So not thousands of words, but just a few key words that are more of like reminders. If you're like my students, you need the whole 45 minutes to read the passage and to write your essay. So I've discouraged my students from really having much of a notes page. And if they are, just again, keep it very brief or only the essential things that they're afraid they will forget. Otherwise, I'm afraid that if it were me taking the exam, I think that I would spend more time with my notes and trying to make my writing perfect, and then I wouldn't finish the essay. So those are some of my recommendations. At the end of the month, you are going to be getting more information about the platform. You'll be given a simulation and a chance to practice. And I will also tell you that our review sessions moving forward will kind of have you practicing through that lens anyway. You'll notice that a lot of our resources are PDFs in the hopes that you get used to how can I look at something and then type or handwrite and not directly annotate. So you'll be getting more information, you'll be getting more practice through our sessions, and then from College Board as well. So just keep those pros and cons in mind. Okay, so since it is not all of the essay prompts, only the rhetorical analysis, I wanted to quickly show you our review schedule starting today all the way through May 1st. You'll notice that these are all going to focus on the rhetorical analysis passage. So last week you practiced with the argument, and that's again because we were trying to make sure we are meeting the needs of colleges and finishing out units 8 and 9. But from here on out, these will pretty much focus on either how to read a passage, how to analyze the choices the writer makes, how to construct your own, and then how to enhance it. So today we're going to talk about how do you attack the prompt. Then we'll go into the rhetorical situation a little bit more. But then you'll see from April 10th through really the 21st, we're going to focus on how do you write, how do you construct a rhetorical analysis. So the introduction, the thesis, the conclusion, how do you develop a body paragraph that follows a line of reasoning, how do you choose your evidence, and how do you introduce it. Then on the 22nd through the 28th, that's when we're going to be looking at specific choices. So on the 22nd, we'll look at a passage that has irony in it. How do you pick up that irony? How do you recognize it? And then we'll move into things like syntax, tonal shifts. And then the last 3 days are looking more at that sophistication point in more depth in specific areas, such as if you look at the rubric, you'll see there's some reference to talking about the relationship among choices. How do you communicate that? We'll talk about how do you work transitions into your writing at the sentence level, not just the paragraph level, to make sure your sentences flow and they build upon each other. And then lastly, sentence variety and precise language. So our sessions will move from kind of just like broad overview about the rhetorical analysis prompt into how do you construct the essay, into how do you analyze the choices, and then concluding with the sophistication point. If you have questions, please reach out to your teachers. I know I've gotten an email from a few of you, so if you have questions, you can reach out to me, especially if you're not sure about a particular title. Me or Mrs. Knight can help you clarify that. All right, so for today, I want you to think about how you feel when you're given a rhetorical analysis question. The prompt, it's a free response question. How do you feel? Do you typically see nothing, that the passage just becomes a blur and you're like, I don't know what is happening. It's all blurry to you. Or you're like, okay, I can get it, but then you just end up being totally confused. And you're like, I don't know what to do with this particular passage or this prompt. I don't understand it. If that's you, then today we're really going to focus on how do you approach the rhetorical analysis free response question. Starting with some of the key elements of a rhetorical analysis free response question. So understanding what they're asking and why they're asking it. Then I'm going to give you my 2 big takeaways, which is How do you annotate the prompt to help you to understand the reading? So then how do you go about reading it? Essentially, I'm going to talk to you today about how do you attack the prompt, because that's actually the perfect way to describe it. It's not some passive activity that you do. You need to go into it with a strong game plan. When the rhetorical, just a little background, when the rhetorical analysis question is being drafted for an exam, the writers, the test development committee, keeps a few things in mind, and these are your expectations. This is what they expect you to be able to do with the free response question. For rhetorical analysis, you should be able to respond to the prompt with a thesis that analyzes the writer's rhetorical choices. You should be able to select and use evidence to develop and support your line of reasoning in your body paragraphs and throughout the entire essay. You should be able to explain the relationship between the evidence in your thesis. Typically, that's your body paragraph. You should demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation. I'm sure you guys are sick of hearing us talk about that, but we will today and tomorrow, because it is such a pivotal moment in the rhetorical analysis essay. And then lastly, you're expected to use appropriate grammar and punctuation in communicating your argument. The people who score your essays, your readers, they know that you're writing this under duress, and they know that it's just a draft. However, the more you can have precise language and appropriate grammar and punctuation, the better the writing and the better the piece is as a whole. So they know that you're doing it under duress, but you're still expected to have appropriate grammar and punctuation. You don't know what you will see on May 20th. I don't know what you'll see on May 20th either, but I do know there is something that will be somewhat consistent from one prompt to the next. They will all have the same wording. Of course, things will change based on the passage itself, but they will all use similar language. You'll be asked to read the prompt, and in the first sentence, at least, sometimes the second, you'll be given some background on the rhetorical situation of the text itself. Then you'll be told to read the passage carefully and write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices. So you will always see that you are asked to write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices. In this case, analyze means to examine methodically and in detail the structure of the topic of the question for purposes of interpretation and explanation. And then this is the next piece I think is really interesting and helpful for you guys. You will always be asked in a prompt to analyze those rhetorical choices the writer makes to develop, achieve, or convey his argument, his or her argument, purpose, or message. And you'll notice here that I've underlined the ellipses, those 3 dots, primarily because when you see the prompt, you're going to be given either some aspect of the argument, the purpose, or the message. Now, keep in mind, it's typically going to be very vague and very broad, not entirely specific, but they will give you some direction. And that's primarily because this isn't directly a comprehension task. It's more about your analysis of those rhetorical choices. So they'll give you a little direction through the argument, the purpose, or the message. They'll give you a little direction so you know how to approach the reading. Because of that, it's imperative that you spend some time studying the prompt. These prompts were written years in advance. They've been vetted and tested and revised and then vetted and tested again to make sure that the language is precise and clear and appropriate for the particular task. So a lot is embedded within. Pay close attention to the prompt. The prompt we're going to be working with today says, in 1997, then United States Secretary Madeleine Albright gave the commencement speech to the graduating class of Mount Holyoke College, a women's college in Massachusetts. Read the passage carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices Albright makes to convey her message about the importance of perseverance. If you see a word like commencement and you don't know what it is, again, know that these prompts have been scrutinized when it's all said and done for probably 3 days straight when they combine all of those hours. So if you don't know a word, know that you've been given context clues somewhere in the prompt or the passage to help clarify that word. So in this case, if you don't know what commencement means, you can see in that follow-up phrase, to the graduating class of Mount Holyoke, College. So you know that commencement is going to be graduation. that these are women graduating from a college, so the speech is some sort of a graduation speech. So if you find a word, don't get bogged down. If you find a word that you don't know, slow down and look at your context clues. And again, it might come through the passage too. All right, so in this prompt, we see those three elements. The rhetorical situation is in the first sentence. Then you are asked to analyze the rhetorical choices, the exact same language you saw before. And then here you see that the message, the clue that they've given you is about the importance of perseverance. It's very broad. You don't necessarily know why it's important or how they might be persevering or in what way or for what reason, but at least you've got some sort of direction when you're reading the prompt, or reading the passage, excuse me. A lot of my students get anxious when they see the length of the passage and they do a quick skim of the prompt and then spend more time with the passage itself, with the text. But what I would really encourage you guys to do is to slow down and take 3 minutes just to break down the prompt itself, to again, really attack the prompt. The prompt will give you like a SparkNotes version of the passage if you take the time to uncover it. So think about specifically the rhetorical situation within the prompt itself. That's what will give you that SparkNotes summary of what you're about to read. And I promise you, it'll make reading the passage itself easier, faster, and more efficient. If you take 3 minutes in the beginning to try to uncover as much as you can about the writer, audience, exigence, purpose, message, and context, then you'll be able to go into the passage that is tough with a lot more confidence. All right, so now I'm going to ask for you to pause the recording. If you go into the description part of the YouTube video, and I think you might have to hit show more, you'll see that there's a link to a folder that has all of our resources. And I'm going to ask for you to pull up the resource that says 4-8 prompt for lesson, I believe, Albright. And I want you to take 3 minutes to read and annotate the prompt for writer, audience, exigence, purpose, message, and context. If you find that you can't do all of those within 3 minutes, then stop and move on, or come back to our recording. Try to take no more than 3 minutes. If you take too much time, then you aren't going to have enough for the passage. So let's say you're taking your 3 minutes and you can only find writer, audience, and message. It's totally fine, but just take 3 minutes and then we'll move into the passage itself. So hit pause and I'll see you in 3 minutes. All right, so if you were marking up your passage, it might look, or your prompt, it might look something like this. The context kind of comes in two places, I think. So 1997, and then a women's college in Massachusetts. That also tells us a little bit about our audience, that they're coming from a women's college. They're graduating college, but they went to an all-girls school. We know that the writer is the United States Secretary Madeleine Albright, so she's in a position of power. We know that the exigence, the reason why she is here speaking, is for a commencement speech. Excuse me, the students have just recently graduated, or they are graduating. The purpose is kind of twofold. It says very clearly to convey, so verbatim, that is the purpose according to the prompt. But we can also start to make some assumptions of if it's a commencement speech, what else might her purpose be? And then lastly, we now know our message is the importance of perseverance. So you've taken 3 minutes, you've studied the prompt, you've broken it down into the rhetorical situation. Now you're ready to start reading the passage, the speech itself. And then again, you need to really have a game plan when it comes to a passage. You need to attack the passage itself. You took 3 minutes for the prompt. I would encourage you to take no more than 7 minutes to read and study the passage. That will mean you're probably doing a quick skim and just trying to get a broad understanding of the text itself. I know for some of you, you want to take 15 minutes. And that makes total sense. I think that I would feel the same way if I were reading and writing an essay in 45 minutes. However, typically with the rhetorical analysis prompt, students, as a reader, they'll write themselves into a higher score. That they might start with their introduction and they have a fine cursory understanding of the passage itself. But then as they're writing their essay, they're going back into the passage and they're studying it more then. So you might go back in the passage to find your examples or to see how they relate to each other. So you are spending time with the passage, but it typically happens as you're writing. So in the beginning, it's really important just to have a clear, accurate understanding and not necessarily an in-depth look at the piece itself. So I tell my students to only take 7 minutes with the passage itself. And these are the steps that I give them. That the first thing I would do is take your passage and write the main ideas in the margins. It might be for each paragraph, it might be, you see that there's a similar idea in 2 paragraphs. Just jotting a few words out to the side will help you to understand, or to make sure that you understand how the passage is moving. So what's happening in the beginning, the middle, and the end. From there, pull out some key lines. And for me, again, it's honestly, I'm just underlining key lines as I'm reading. I am going to encourage you though to not just, I think that some students are like, I'm going to underline anything that's important to me, which makes sense. But remember that we've been given the message about the importance of perseverance. So I would encourage you to underline anything that really speaks to perseverance in a new or unique way. Hopefully her speech will be very cohesive in its argument, but if you see that she addresses a different side of perseverance, you might want to underline that. The other thing you might want to think about doing is underlining anything that's helping to explain some aspect of the rhetorical situation, like the speaker or the audience, because that too might illuminate a little bit more about the argument. And then from there, studying your key lines. So taking more time to read back through what you've underlined will help kind of shore up your understanding of the text itself. I would recommend, though, that you study a key line from multiple points in the passage itself. Sometimes students are like, oh, well, I found 3 key lines and they're all at the end. I'm like, great, but you might be missing some really crucial or pivotal information in the beginning of the passage. So I would encourage you to pull lines from a variety of places within the text itself. Then, I know we're redundant, but again, underline anything that speaks to the rhetorical situation, where you see those values and beliefs, or anything you're learning about the audience and the speaker. Those are the 2 most important components. So look for those things, and that might be very broad and holistic. It might come from your study of your key lines, but it might just be, okay, now that I read the piece as a whole, here's how I would revise what I learned from the prompt. That the prompt didn't steer me wrong, but now I have more specific information. And then this last piece is the tricky one, and that's looking at what I call when I say to my students, chunks. So looking at shifts within the passage. It could be something like the writer talks about this topic in the beginning and then this topic in the end. It might be a shift, so like a shift in subject matter. It might be a shift in attitude or tone. So it might start with the writer being very cautious and then moving to very inspirational. It could be something like scientific and dry to moving to a more emotional laden piece. Think about how the passage moves and evolves and how it's organized as you're reading as well. That typically comes at the very end, because then you're able to look at how what you've written in the margins of the notes, how those move. So it might not be that you're looking at the passage as you're looking at your annotations to see if there are any kinds of shifts. I will give you some clues. First, you might not always see a shift. Spoiler alert, you will in today's. And that typically you see that there are 2 or 3 shifts total. So the obvious is first half of the passage, second half of the passage. Another one, though, is when you'll see 3, and it's typically the beginning, the middle, and the end. More sophisticated readers are able to identify these chunks. So it's a more nuanced skill. If you aren't there yet, it's not a big deal, but definitely look for those first 4. All right, so I'm going to ask for you to Now read through the speech that I've given you. You looked at the prompt before. Now look at the speech itself and take 7 minutes to attack the passage, looking for the main ideas, jotting those down in a few words in the margins, underlining and studying any key lines that address the message, the speaker, or the audience, deepening your understanding of the rhetorical situation, and then if possible, looking at some chunks. I also think that this is a really good time to practice what you might see with the AP exam, which is I'm going to have the passage pulled up, but I can't mark directly on it. So how am I going to take notes on a separate piece of paper? So maybe you think through that piece a little bit too. I'm going to give you guys a few minutes, and then I'm going to come in and show you guys what I would have done with this passage so you can compare and contrast your annotations with mine. So take about 7 minutes, pause the recording, and then pop back in and we'll go through the guided practice of this. All right, so looking at your notes, see if they match up to some extent with my own. They probably are not the exact same, and that's absolutely fine. A lot of this is subjective, but hopefully this will be a little bit of a guide for you to be like, oh, I totally misread this part of the passage, or, oh, I had this idea that Mrs. Velitis didn't mention, which is also totally plausible. So your first step to attack the passage is to write the main idea in the margins. So if this was your passage, and I were handwriting my notes on it, I might see that the main idea kind of shifts throughout the passage. That Albright starts her speech talking about how democracy's improved our lives, and she's talking about the Berlin Wall and nuclear weapons. Then she starts to move into a discussion about how the US hasn't given up, that they aren't being complacent. And so that, even though the fighting in Bosnia has stopped, we're still implementing the Dayton Accords and we're supporting the War Crimes Tribunal. Then the middle of her speech, and you can see I'm already previewing the chunks a little bit, she starts to move into the role of women. She says, women are starting to stand up more, they're acting as leaders, they're persevering. She gives an example or several examples of strong women at the bottom of the first column, the top of the second, of women all over the world. And then in the last portion, that's when she really starts to turn to her audience. And she says, like you can see in terms of style, she's using the pronoun you a lot more, saying you will encounter resistance, and that you should set high goals. And if you set some high goals that are actually high goals that you should be setting, they're not easy or lazy or complacent goals, then that means you will be facing resistance. So that's a good thing to face resistance. It means that you're setting your sights high. And then it concludes with what I would write in the margin, just a call to action of saying to the students, the graduates, embrace the faith that your courage and perseverance will make a difference. So trust in yourself and trust in your values, and it will get you there. Then the next step is to underline some key lines, study them, read them over a few times to make sure you understand the passage. I'm assuming we all have different lines, but these were 4 that really spoke to me. If you need to hit pause to read them, you certainly can. But essentially in the first line, the first one comes from lines 40 to 44. She's basically talking about how women are fighting for their rights, trying to make their voices heard. They're standing up and spreading the word that we're ready to claim our rightful place. Then in the second, she says in line 64 to 66, after giving the examples of women all over the world, she says, these women have a common determination to chart their own path. She says, be your own person. And if you do so, it will positively impact both your community and your country. It will have both small and large benefits. She then starts to talk about in line 72 to 74 that no matter how tough the opposition may seem, have courage still and persevere. And this is a line that's repeated a lot throughout the passage, and persevere. So she's like, don't give up. You're going to face the opposition. You're going to face challenges and those who disagree with you, and that shouldn't stop your course. Keep moving. And then lastly, she ends with this call to action. I had to break it down and just use the ellipses, basically saying, trust that your perseverance is worth it. She says it will ennoble your own life, so it will dignify and empower you. And it will also inspire others, serve your country, and explode outward the boundaries of what is achievable on this earth. So that tells us a lot about the rhetorical situation. When we looked at the prompt itself, we had kind of like a vague, generic idea, but then after going through the speech itself, we can take those ideas and deepen them, that she's not just the Secretary of State, but she's met with and worked with and come to know women who are fighting for equality and democracy. We can make assumptions and we can infer that these female graduates have high expectations for themselves because through our noting in the margins, Madeleine Albright takes several paragraphs just to address this notion of setting high goals. Before, the purpose was just to convey, and the prompts will always have kind of like a generic purpose, but when you start to study the piece a little bit more, you see there's a little bit of like caution of like, hey, be aware, you might face some challenges, that ultimately she's there to inspire and to motivate them. And so you might recognize that tonal shift a little bit in the piece too. The context, we don't get a ton, we do get a little bit more, specifically when it comes to the other women around the world. All right, so let's get to the tough piece that I'm hoping is a lot clearer to you now that you've written your notes in the margins. How would you chunk the passage, or how might you identify certain shifts? I'm hoping that if you kind of step back and you look at the notes you've written in the margins, it will help you to know what direction to take your essay. So in this case, I see that her first chunk is really all about the importance of democracy in the American spirit, because I see things like democracy in US in my first two sets of notes. Then she's talking about the role of women around the world. She gives examples of the strong women and then talks about how they're kind of like all united in this effort. And then the last thing, is their task and what the women should be doing, what they need to understand about themselves and their plight in this larger community. All right, one thing we've not talked about yet that I'm going to add into our list of how to attack the passage is to then start to identify rhetorical choices. It's so much easier for you to then say to yourself, all right, if my first body paragraph is all about the importance of democracy in the American spirit, now I'm going to look at which choices does she make in her speech that helps to communicate that idea. And then your body paragraphs are really governed by ideas, not devices, which is ultimately what we want. Or when it comes to the third body, I would have 3 body paragraphs. When it comes to my third body paragraph, then I'd be looking at if she's ultimately writing in that section about women and what they need to understand, then how does she communicate that? How does she ultimately persuade them to believe that? And that's where your choices come from. In the coming days, we'll talk a lot more about rhetorical strategies versus devices, especially on Monday. So in case you want to tune in on Monday, we'll be talking more about that. But this is where you would start writing your essay, that you've essentially already mapped out the whole shape of your essay by going through these steps and attacking your passage. You know what your first body paragraph is about, your second, and your third. And that's when you would go back in and study it more closely. So I might say, okay, now my second body paragraph is going to be about the role of women around the world. What are my examples? I'm going to go back in and study that particular section and look for those choices. So this becomes the guide for your body paragraph. Body paragraphs in your whole essay. It's like your outline ready to go. All right, so just to review, when it comes to the free response question, I would take 10 minutes of just drafting, reading, and preparing. 3 minutes for your prompt, really just looking for the rhetorical situation, and then 7 minutes to skim the passage itself, writing ideas in the margins, underlining and studying some key lines, trying to deepen your understanding of the rhetorical situation in the passage itself, looking to see, okay, now that I have my notes in the margins, am I seeing anything about how the passage moves or how it's shaped that might guide what I end up writing? And then again, the last step is to look for those rhetorical choices that support those ideas. Then that gives you 35 minutes to write. If you take less time with the prompt and the passage in order to have 40 minutes to write, there's a chance that you're going to have to slow yourself down with the writing, that you're going to have to go back into the passage. You have to check yourself against the prompt. Whereas if you do the front loading, if you build all that in the first 10 minutes, your writing is pretty much set up and ready for you to go. So that's my advice. That's what I tell my students. I know you want to spend 15 minutes on the passage. You will end up spending 15 minutes on the passage when you're writing. So try to keep just to a cursory understanding in the very beginning and then dive in as you need while writing. All right, so for your practice tonight, you have a passage, a new passage, another speech in here titled 4.8, I think 4.8 AP Practice dash Thatcher. It's another speech from Margaret Thatcher in this case. And I'm going to ask for you guys to take no more than 10 minutes. Practice limiting yourself to that time frame. Take 10 minutes to study the prompt and the passage following those steps that I provided today. 3 minutes to annotate the prompt and 7 minutes to get a basic cursory understanding. And then tomorrow I'll walk you through, kind of like we just did, of here is how I would have annotated the prompt itself. Here's how I would have chunked out the passage. So we'll do that tomorrow. And I hope you have a great day. Thank you for watching. It's good to see your faces again, or to know at least that you're out there. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.